Okay, that's lovely. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for waking up early and making it all the way up to Mount Steps. My name is Juanita, and in the past 2.5 years, I've been coordinating the Sophie Davis Forum on Gender and Conflict here at Hebrew U. The forum is part of the Lorna Davis Institute for International Studies, which is a separate unit from the department. Part of what we've been doing in the past 2.5 years is running a monthly series called the Learning Community, in which we, thank you very much, in which we try to offer new concepts or renew concepts that do not necessarily have a feminist agency-related meaning, and kind of drag them into the feminist kit tool and work with them in context of conflict and gender. So the concept that we're going to work with in the next 2 days, borders and walls, are going to be the concepts that are going to be, we're going to try and push them and think about them not as boundaries as we usually think about them, but as opportunities to engage in new relationships, opportunities to widen our knowledge, and opportunity to create new things beyond those borders and with them. Sometimes thinking about the borders themselves not as an obstacle, but as something to start and work with. I want to give 2 examples before we start. The first one is about this location in specific. I grew up listening to my dad's stories about Moscow. It wasn't about married life at the student residence. It was about his time laying in ambushes down there at the British cemetery when Moscow was a UN-protected Israeli exclave within the Jordanian territory. One of my favorite stories was about a donkey freaking the life out of him one night, and 4 decades later I came here to learn, to gain knowledge. I did my BA here and my master's, and then I moved far, far away to Canada, to the University of British Columbia to do my PhD. About a week into then, I realized that this university is on a traditional, ancestral, unceded land of the Hamkaminian-speaking masculine people. That was a bit of a non-expected thing to learn that I found myself again in the midst of a conflicted territory. I don't know if I'm the person who finds campuses that way. Maybe they're all like that. But there's something special about going to school in a conflicted area. If you open your eyes, you get to learn a lot more than you thought you were going to learn. And for me, both of these campuses were an opportunity. Similarly, going back to the Hamkaminian-speaking masculine people, we're holding an English-speaking event here at the Hebrew University. And when we put this event together, there are a few voices saying, hey, but why in English? Especially that so many of the things that we're going to talk about here are very related to the local reality, namely that we actually have to translate experiences in Hebrew into a different language. And translation is never a complete endeavor, and it's very frustrating. So it's really not obvious, and not everybody find it easy to do. We're paying a price by making this choice. Some people did not feel that they can participate. Some people did not feel that they can even attend. Because languages are barriers. They're gatekeepers. They keep some of us away. They're also like passport. They allow some people to travel more widely, but not all languages allow the same freedom of movement. And English is one of those languages that is a marker of cultural capital, and leave some people in and some people out. So we are paying a price, but it also invites us to do things, this translation process, because it forces us to look at our own assumptions and explain our own convictions in a different way. And by doing that, we gain a better understanding of our own knowledge. In addition, when we try to explain our own knowledge to other people, we maybe flatten it a little bit. But we get to converse about similar experiences and maybe get a better sense of the phenomenon we work with, and then have different explanation for it. So what I was trying to say is that borders and walls, they can prevent us to get from places to places, and they can prevent us to communicate, but they can also become an opportunity. And this is what we're trying to do here in the next 2-3 days. We will try to use the conversations, the lectures, the panels, the tours, in order to think about 3 main thematic things. The first one is this movement between a very particular case study, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and various comparison lands. The second one is this movement between a public or a political כן, אז במקום הנכון.
חשבתי.
הבנתי. Between a public or a political topic and a domestic or a private topic. Thinking about the university as a case within a case. And the university, which is our home for many of us, it's an interesting kind of experience to think about it in the feminist terminology of private and public. And last, to think about all of this work related to borders in relation to continuum. On the one hand, as something that prevents us from getting into knowledge, getting into relationships, that maintains differences, and on the other hand, as something that is enable them and actually challenges them. Of course, we will not be able to go over all the conflicts within the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, or all the possible comparison lands, but I hope that we will be able to take some of what we talk about here and use these insights thinking about other sides as well. So, before I move on to our dean, I want to acknowledge that nothing, this conference would not have happened without the great help of and support of Professor Dani, who is the head of the Lerner Davis Institute. Since I arrived 2.5 years ago, he supported every not very traditional idea I had, and that brought us sort of here. And I'm really not taking it for granted, so thank you very much. And I had the pleasure to work with Tamil in the past year, and it has been a wonderful experience. So thank you for all your support and for being here today.
Thank you.
And yeah.
Okay.
Sure. And
So,
you can use your own sign. You don't have to be Tani San in the video.
all right. Where is it? Okay. So welcome to the Hebrew University on behalf of the Faculty of Social Sciences. The program looked fascinating. So I'm sure you're going to have exciting 3 days, including, I see, a grand tour of the wall and the city. So it's going to be fascinating. Enjoy it. I would like to tell you, to take the opportunity to tell you that we are working now on developing a new space of gender and diversity space, which is a combination or a cooperation between the Sophie Davis Center, between the Leifer program for gender between the local, what is here from local program, International Development, and Michal Barak Center for Diversity. So this is, we hope that this center, this space, will be a home for both research and studies and study programs. And we hope that it will happen really, really soon. So this is kind of interesting news, I think, for this forum. That's it. So we'll get to you back with more news when we'll have, but it should be soon. Thank you for Tal and Danny and Michal and Hanoch from Leonard Davis, and enjoy the program.
Thanks so much. And as I said, nothing would have happened without Dan Hidovnik. So.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Hebrew University and to this wonderful workshop. One of the problems, I'm always the last one to speak. It's my turn to speak. Everybody has said already what I planned. So I always have to improvise on the fly, and it's kind of getting more complicated. But first of all, I want to say a couple of things about the Sophie Davis Forum. It is part of the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations that I had the pleasure of being the director for the last 3.5 years, 4 years, who counts. I think around 10 years ago, Ellen and Mary Lou Davis heard the presentation. I always do this to Sarai, but I'm going to continue to it. Heard the presentation of Sarai. Ronnie was then affiliated with the Davis Institute. And all of a sudden, everything clicked to them. And following that presentation, they said, maybe we could give some money to the Hebrew University, to the Leonard Davis Institute, to develop a new program. And that program that Sarai was one of the initiators turned out to be the Sophie Davis program for gender, conflict. I always remember the full title, forget the full title. That being said, peace. Struggle against constipation. I mean, whatever. So in the last, and I think that the first activity started in 2010 or 11, and ever since we've been working in different ways, in different manners. And 3 years ago, we were really fortunate that following the offer we made, Tal decided to actually leave Canada and return to Israel, which wasn't an easy thing for her to do for so many reasons. And we were really fortunate actually to get a young scholar activist who took her position here very, very seriously and started developing something and shaping something that now may actually become have a lasting contribution. Definitely, if we are going to establish this center with Michal and Reut and Moshe, a lasting contribution on the way that the Hebrew University in general, and more specifically the faculties of humanities, law, and social sciences see the importance of, let's call it gender studies, gender reading of reality, and so on. So I'm really thankful for we were so fortunate to get that. And I think that's all I'm going to say right now. I'm going to allow this day to begin, because I think you had enough introductions for now. That's it. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you're going to have a beautiful workshop. And,
Thank you. is to introduce speakers, right? I can read that little piece that Juanita sent me, and there was other lines that are written there, and they're very important. And but Juanita was on my committee for my PhD, and it's really hard for me to describe her through these lines. So I will tell you that Juanita is a feminist geographer, and when I came to UBC, I didn't know that geographers do, some of them, very similar things to what anthropologists do. And I was very, very fortunate to have Juanita on my committee, because she is not only very familiar with my topic, because she has great familiarity with Guatemala, even though she works mostly on the Mexico and US border. Can someone open? Oh. But I was fortunate because Juanita is one of those scholars who know how to ask the hard, difficult, complicated, challenging questions, and yet do it in a way that is not creating antagonism, but challenge you to answer them and try to find answers and try to really work hard to understand where is the point that she challenged you on. And this is a great talent. And I'm very, very grateful for it. And I think that this is part of the reason that I really wanted her to be here today, because she is able to take us to these places, show us where interesting things happen, not necessarily give us the answer, but really direct us to a place to find answers within ourselves. So for this, I am grateful and will be grateful forever. In addition to her work on borders, one of the really fascinating things that Juanita does is, how would you call it, pedagogical experiments? Yes. Well, one of the very interesting things that I've encountered in her work are yearly courses in which she engages her students to address. They first decide on a problem, on a social problem, in a relationship between the Northern Americas and the Southern Americas, and they try to explain this problem, social problem, to themselves, create connections, and study it. After they've grasped a better understanding of it, they teach it to the community. And when I talk about the community, I'm not only talking about the university community, but about the public and the city. And for me, that was the most engaging, that word I was looking for, engaging pedagogy. And for me, that was a fascinating way to do teaching in university, because we hardly see these kind of things. I actually do see it here at Hebrew University when we talk about things that I've learned here and things that I've learned there, in a course that I took with Professor Daphne Goran. So the ability to create, make students create their own knowledge through communications with civil society and then take it outside, crosses so many borders within the way we understand academic knowledge and academic knowledge production, and knowledge dissemination. And then again, this is another really important reason that I really wanted Juanita to be here today. So, without further ado,
thank you. Should I stand? Doesn't matter.
wherever you want.
Thank you so much, Tal, for that lovely introduction. I don't think I've ever heard anyone make an introduction like that, and it's really beautiful. I appreciate it, and I will say to all of you here that that Tal's presence on the UBC campus is not only missed, but she also left a really strong impression, and I continue to come across little moments and spaces and people that were touched by Tal's time there. So thank you very much. Well, as Tal mentioned, I am here from a university that is on unceded territories of the Musqueam Indigenous people in Vancouver. And here today on these contested lands, a place that I never dreamed that I would touch. So I am very, very grateful for all of the different institutions and coordinations and efforts that people made to make this possible. Thank you, Dan and Tamir, I guess he's gone, for the introduction, for hosting, again, for creating the possibility for this to happen, and to Hanoch, I don't know if he's still here, for coordinating all the logistics. I know that getting academics to do simple tasks is like herding cats. I have 2 cats, and I know just how much they don't like to be made to do anything that they don't want to do or that costs them a little extra effort. So thank you for that, and for that, your patience with that. Let's see, I think that's good, yeah. And for the Halbert Center for Canadian Studies also, for making this all possible. So yes, I'm very excited, and I look forward to exchanging ideas and hearing the things that you will be presenting. We're going to be talking about a really different context, but I think that you'll probably hear all kinds of resonances and moments where similarities emerge. So I look forward to our conversations about that, and I'm just going to grab my water. I wanted to say very quickly, I am sort of co-authoring this paper with Lee Barrick, who was a PhD student who worked with me, and she defended her dissertation in the fall of last year. And the reason that I decided to work with Lee is that while I approach things as a feminist geographer, my work on the US-Mexico border historically has not addressed issues of gender. And I kind of freaked out when I thought that I was going to have to talk about gender, not because there's nothing to say, but just because it's not exactly where my work has focused. And so this is kind of an interesting sort of collaboration between Lee and I. Okay, let's make sure this works. Maybe. I just have to press the little arrow, right? Nice. Where do I direct it? Excuse me. Yeah, okay, yes, we keep going here. Okay. I think all of you will agree with me that borders are processes structured by gender and difference. Oops. Okay, good. All right. And to quote 2 feminist geographers, colleagues of mine, borders are also moments of truth when power that often operates more subtly is exposed in all of its incarnations. As such, borders present confrontational moments in which we must declare ourselves and in which others exercise power to identify. And today I'll be talking about the border between the United States and Mexico, where contests over the power to identify, classify, and exclude have highly unequal outcomes that for some are potentially calamitous. Let's see. Oh, went the wrong way. I was going the wrong way, that was the problem. Okay. All right, the border between Mexico and the United States, as you may very well know, has been identified over and over again as a site of chaos and violence. It's a boundary that's literally, in some places, drawn in the sand, and framed as a place where intruders are seeking to overrun illegally. At present, migrants from places further south, Mexico, Central America, have been traveling north to the US border in caravans to protect themselves from the dangerous journey. And many are awaiting their chance to petition for asylum. in the US. The current president of the United States portrays these people as dangerous. So threatening are they to national security, he has recently declared a state of emergency in order to do the kinds of things he wishes to do to keep them out. From the moment he declared himself a candidate for the presidential race, Trump has used migrants in his campaign, Make America Great Again. When he announced his run for the Republican nomination, he declared the following, which I've written here. The US has become a dumping ground, right, for everybody else's problems. And these are probably words that you've seen in the news, right? When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. I'll just highlight a few things here. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. Yes, we all laughed as well. I was going to show this little clip here, but I think I won't do it. But the reason that I wanted to show it is a moment in the presidential debates between Trump and Hillary Clinton. Trump made some comments where he said, we have some bad hombres here, meaning men, right? And we're going to get them out. And scholars have indicated that by using the word hombre in Spanish, right, he wants everyone to know who he's specifically talking about. He's not just talking about men, he's talking about men from Mexico, but also Central America. And when he uses this specter of bad hombres, right, to call for a border wall, to protect the US body politic from danger, he signals that gender, sexuality, and race are at play. Just a few more things to be sure that we understand what Trump means when he talks about bad hombres. Here's another quote, and a tweet by his son. These aren't people. These are animals. Right? And here you know why you can enjoy a day at the zoo, because walls work. I'll just stay here for a second. As feminist geographers, we find it imperative to produce knowledge of a different kind in the hopes of displacing and reconfiguring these dominant discourses, because they serve to normalize and keep in place geographical imaginaries of nation states as discrete and bounded territories, and produce images of other places like Mexico and Central America as inherently violent and therefore inferior. These imaginaries unleash and perpetuate violence against migrants by exposing them to humiliation, abuse, and potentially premature death in the US borderlands. Meanwhile, through these kinds of dichotomous or dualistic representations, the US government and its citizens are cleared of any kind of complicity and responsibility for such violence. So in this presentation today, my goal is to expose the gendered and racialized geopolitical thinking that is woven into the Trump administration's decisions and practices that have redefined asylum in the United States. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, migrants at the southern border, many of whom are there to petition for asylum, are portrayed as criminals, animals, bad hombres, right? Intruders who threaten the US domestic space. In June 2018, as hundreds of Central Americans literally sat at the border, awaiting their chance to petition for asylum, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions issued a ruling that changed legal frameworks for asylum in the US. The ruling that he made overturned legal precedent by transforming domestic violence and so-called gang violence into private or personal matters. His decision states, the applicant for, this is the first part, generally claims by aliens, of course he has to call them aliens so that they're not people, right? They're not even animals, they're just aliens. Claims by aliens pertaining to domestic violence or gang violence perpetrated by non-government actors will not qualify for asylum. the applicant for asylum must show that their government condoned the private actions or demonstrated an inability to protect the victims. In other words, if In other words, if public security institutions in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, for example, did not interject or intervene in the acts of violence that are depicted by asylum seekers, then such acts were merely private squabbles, right, between individuals. Victims of private acts of violence or discrimination do not qualify for asylum. Asylum seekers, however, tell very different stories about the circumstances that they face in their home countries. And we are guided by their testimonies as we contest the geographical imaginaries that structure Trump and Sessions' thinking about migrants seeking entry to the US. And here, just a little caveat. Lee did her dissertation research on asylum claims, and she was able to work with some legal institutions that actually go into detention centers and offer legal advice. So in those cases, she wasn't collecting testimony, but she had access to the lawyers and to other testimonies that were available. And she also did some research for the United Nations on family separation. So in that case, she was actually doing interviews with asylum seekers, but also then for the UN for the creation of a policy paper. Theoretically then, to do this analysis, we build on the analytical lens of gender relations, as well as, quote, a long-standing feminist tradition of challenging gender-based oppositions by upending hierarchies of space and scale. And here I'm quoting two colleagues of mine, or Geraldine Pratt, who's one of my colleagues. Specifically, we demonstrate how the Attorney General's rulings map an imperial imaginary and a public-private dualism onto the violence that migrants report. As we go on to demonstrate, these two spatial formations undermine asylum seeker claims by framing countries subject to US domination as racially inferior, and by feminizing spaces of violence as private and therefore disconnected from politics and political violence. This is especially the case with asylum claims put forward by young men, the so-called bad hombres, from the three countries increasingly lumped into what is being called the Northern Triangle. I don't even know where this idea came from, to call these countries the Northern Triangle, but it's kind of like this lumping of this site of violence and chaos. Though much critical work on asylum rectifies previous neglect by focusing on women's experience, we center the challenges facing young men petitioning for asylum. When the US president lumps all of these young men into the category of bad hombres, criminals, murderers, and rapists, it is highly unlikely they can receive a fair hearing. In other words, we want to suggest that in addition to the work that has been done on women and asylum, we want to argue that young men are gendered in very particular ways in these circumstances as bad hombres, in ways that make the likelihood of their asylum cases being heard fairly at all very unlikely. To analyze how gender, sexuality, and race structure Trump's narratives, I just want to briefly highlight our theoretical framework. And I've written quite a lot here, but I don't want to repeat stuff that people already know, and I'm not really sure, because I don't really know who's in the room very well. So I hopefully, it'll be interesting to some of you. As a feminist geographer, I sort of came to feminist geography not by my training, but by necessity. And the more time that I spend in the academy, the more feminist scholarship and the tools that feminism offers I need those to critique and understand what is going on in the world around me in some of these academic spaces, and many of you will probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Lee's dissertation also drew on the feminist framework that I'm going to talk about here. So just very briefly, we are using two different frameworks, or they're intersecting, Feminist Geopolitics and the Global Intimate. And these frameworks offer tools that are suited for our analysis to really understand how and why the Trump administration chooses very specific geographical imaginaries to drum up support for border security and for this change in asylum policies. I came from a very wet place to a very dry place, so forgive me. So yeah, Feminist Geopolitics, probably familiar to some of you, builds on the path-breaking work of Cynthia Enloe and the feminist scholarship that she inspired in political science, international relations, and political geography. And I say that it's likely familiar to all of it, to many of you, and to be honest, I really worried about using this framework. I kind of had this idea that, oh, you know, feminist geopolitics, it's kind of like, you know, we did that, we've been there, we don't need to go back. But as I started really looking at the gendered narratives and these geographical imaginaries that are shaping asylum, I realized that these feminist frameworks just don't seem to grow old. Like, we just need them. And even if they have been developed, you know, decades ago, the hegemonic forms of masculinity that they critique in various dimensions continue to take up space and shape power relations in not very novel ways, right? And so the feminist critiques that have been put forward are exactly appropriate for this approach. And as long as this sort of hegemonic masculinity repeats itself, then we need these feminist approaches. And no matter how often we repeat ourselves, we have to continue exposing the violent inherent to masculinist forms of power as domination. So very briefly, a few words about feminist geopolitics. At the heart of this work is an epistemological claim. The actors who, and this is the claim, actors who participate in making international relations are embodied, right? Meaning they are socialized into normative regimes of racialized, gendered, and sexual relations, et cetera, et cetera. And it follows from this that normative, gendered, discursive practices matter greatly to geopolitical relations, including norms of sexuality and bodily comportment, and in the United States, these are always entangled with regimes of racialization. In making the body the subject of research, feminist embodied epistemologies have shined light on bodies as the public sites of geopolitical practices, sites where violence may be enacted in the name of enforcing national boundaries. Along these lines, feminist researchers highlight how hierarchical gender binaries are used to structure geopolitical relations, asking how global space is gendered, sexualized, and racialized. For instance, gendered spatial formations, like the public and the private, are called upon in discussions of where and how geopolitical power is exercised, often in ways that minimize how women participate in geopolitical discursive practices. Feminist scholarship refuses these binary framings that not only separate spaces, but also organize them hierarchically. The global intimate framework comes out of feminist political geography and provides a strategy for avoiding hierarchical approaches to space and scale by pairing the global and the intimate so as to read them through and against each other and show how they intertwine. Drawing on geographer Doreen Massey's critique of the global and the local as separate spaces and hierarchically organized scales, the Global Intimate Framework refuses to allow such geographical binaries and hierarchies to structure feminist thinking. Instead, feminist scholarship shows how the spatial practices of everyday life are intertwined with the geopolitical. The structures of feeling, for instance, that allow mothers and fathers to believe in war, even if it means losing their children. Or the child-rearing practices that encourage exclusionary forms of belonging, an us who hates a them. Ultimately, feminist geopolitics interweaves the intimate with the geopolitical in the same way the personal and the political are always intertwined in feminist work. So bringing these tools into play, we first embody the Trump administration to examine how gender, sexuality, and race inform his imaginaries of the nation and belonging. And throughout the discussion, I'm gonna use some humorous images. Sometimes they might be a little bit vulgar, but I contained myself because you will not believe what's out there. To acknowledge the ways people are telling jokes, right? To highlight the hypocrisies of the political elite, especially Trump and his family. But at the same time, humorous jokes and memes draw on and reproduce existing power relations between men and women, for example. A scholar named Michelle Smirnova suggests that humor of this kind helps us to keep in mind the challenges of dismantling heteronormative, patriarchal, and racist power relations. So hegemonic toxic masculinity and the Make America Great Again movement. So critics of Donald Trump's election to the presidency in the United States point to the return of so-called outdated forms of masculinity, using terms like vulgar and vindictive masculinity, toxic masculinity, and dominating masculinity. Scholars call the forms of masculinity that they're referring to as hegemonic masculinity, defined as power relations structured to legitimize and justify institutionalized heteronormative and racist patriarchy, and generate hierarchical relationships not only between the sort of binary framing of men and women, but also between and amongst men. This form of masculinity exists in relation to other forms, but at present, in the United States, in any case, it reigns supreme. More to the point, hegemonic masculinity never went away, although certainly it has been greatly emboldened by the current president. And I just have to say that I kind of hated putting pictures, whoops. I didn't put that there. So good. I didn't even want to this is really weird. Okay, I didn't even want to show all these pictures of Trump, but it just the repetition, right? It just like, anyway, it hopefully there's some kind of irony and like humor in these images. All right, let's get out of this one. Okay. Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," signals the restoration of his supporters' interpretation of the natural order, right? The God-given right of white men to assert control over the bodies of women and, in their case, hopefully enslaved men, right? And to dispossess indigenous peoples of their property, all in the name of nation building. Trump's slogan builds on the claim that white men have lost their natural right to dominate, and they need to take it back. Not surprisingly then, the nationalism of the white right frames belonging in patriarchal white supremacist terms. The nation from this perspective was founded by and should be under the control of white men who know what is best for all these inferior others. As head of state, Trump frames himself as protector of this nation, which is under threat and in need of saving from bad hombres, rapists, drug traffickers, and criminals. Sociologist C.J. Pascoe points to rape as one way dominant men emasculate other men. Although Trump has been accused of sexual assault by multiple women, he mobilizes rape, framing it as the practice of lesser men, in his case, migrant men of color, cast as sexually and racially inferior. In so doing, Trump effectively positions himself as the ideal strong man who protects rather than harms women. This is another case that feminists have identified previously as white men saving brown women from brown men. The rise of Trumpism has prompted what some scholars call a contest of masculinity. Who counts as a real man? A piece in The Guardian some months after Trump's inauguration was called, "Are you a Trump man or a decent man? Time to choose." C.J. Pascoe problematizes this dichotomy between Trump men and decent men. For more often than not, she suggests, critics of Trump use the very same themes he does: dominance over women and men deemed less masculine. For instance, a famous phone call between Trump and Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto. Now, this is a cartoon in Spanish, and I couldn't find a translation, and then I ran out of time to translate it. But I will just tell you very quickly. He tells Peña Nieto that, you guys have a lot of bad hombres down there, right? And you need to do something about it. So that's one scenario. America is great. America goes first. I'm gonna win because, we're gonna be ahead because I'm a winner. And this guy's like, oh, I don't understand anything, which is making fun of the fact that Peña Nieto's English was so bad. And then here they're framed as lovers, right? One is saying, you hang up, and the other one's like, no, you hang up first, right? So it's kind of using, again, these ideas of domination over other men, right? And then framing ideas of homosexuality between men to frame Peña Nieto as a lesser man, a failed hombre. We also have all kinds of other cartoons and memes. Here we have Trump saying, well, that was really great, but I'm still gonna build my wall, right? So again, Peña Nieto is being framed as an emasculated man. And here, that idiot Peña Nieto says, I have a small jalapeno, right? So, we haven't left any of hegemonic masculinity's dominant themes, right? Even if these are making fun of and they're criticizing, they remain within the same frame. And then, of course, we have these famous images, right, of his relationship with Putin. So again, the critics are using the same kinds of themes. This one is funny. All right. And of course, then most recently on February 15th, Trump declares the national emergency, quote, because an invasion of our country with drugs, with human traffickers, with all types of criminals and gangs. Oh, did I skip something? All right. Okay, so I want to move into thinking about Trump and his walls. Why is Trump so obsessed with walls? And he says, you can call them peaches for all I care. Something, I feel like I missed something, I'm sorry. All right. So, critics on the left are saying, why does Trump want these walls? It was the sort of president that everyone loves, Ronald Reagan, that said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down these walls, right? So Reagan is the penultimate, the king of presidents for the white right. And yet he famously, right, said, Gorbachev, tear down that wall. So, within U.S. border security policies, it was starting in 1994 that the U.S. government decided to build actual physical barriers and walls on the boundary between the United States and Mexico. And this is an image from some of my previous work that talks about how those walls in particular parts of the border were actually designed to push people who wanted to cross the U.S. border into what are called remote and hostile lands. And the idea was that if people weren't allowed to cross in the historic crossing points in urban areas, where they could blend in with the local population, because in some of the borderland areas, the population is 80 to 90% Hispanic. The idea was that if they weren't able to cross in those places, and they saw that they were being pushed into these sort of remote and isolated and dangerous lands, that they just wouldn't cross, right? Of course, that was a failure, and a policy failure, in the sense that it did nothing to change the number of people who were trying to cross, which is only evaluated by the number of Border Patrol apprehensions, so actually nobody ever really knows. They just know how many people the Border Patrol claim to apprehend. So it didn't change the number of people crossing. In fact, after this policy was put into place, the number of people crossing continued to escalate and escalate and escalate. What it did do was lead to an increase in the number of people who died trying to cross into the United States, and people began dying from things like environmental exposure, so basically hypothermia in the desert, and also drowning in certain places where there's water on the border. And what this policy did was it basically ended circular migration. In other words, people who basically went into the US, and historically it was men, worked for a number of months or a year and went back to Mexico. After this policy and these walls that were put into place, people said, well, it's too dangerous to cross every year, so basically we're just gonna stay in the US. We're not gonna leave. And so the policy failed in that sense. It didn't lower the apprehensions, and it actually increased the number of undocumented people living in the United States. And it also resulted in, some people argue, 6,000 people have died trying to cross since the policy was put into place. Others say we have no way of knowing because bodies are continuously found in the desert in conditions of, what do you call it? Yeah.
Decomposition.
Decomposition, thank you. And that means that we don't even know how many are never found. So Trump's obsession with walls, much to the surprise of many people who don't realize that there are already hundreds of miles of walls on the US-Mexico border. And those walls were authorized in 2006 by the US Congress under George W. Bush. And so there's about 650 miles of boundaries on a 650 miles on a border that's about 1,200 miles. So despite these sort of policy failures that I've mentioned, the number of people crossing into the United States seems to have declined precipitously. Of course, some people argue that it's the walls, and other people argue, well, in fact, it has everything to do with the 2008 recession in the United States and nothing to do with the policy. Those are the kinds of things that are heavily debated, and we may not ever know what the correct answer is, and there may not ever be a one answer, right? Nonetheless, there hasn't really been any new activity or anything dramatic at the border since these walls have been put into place. Nonetheless, when Trump sort of declared his run for presidency, he made the border wall, right, one of the primary keys to his campaign. He used the wall as a rallying cry, right, reaching out primarily to white people in the United States whose circumstances and well-being have significantly deteriorated, precisely because of the economic policies put forward by a small, wealthy elite, of which Trump is one, right? And their vision of unregulated capitalism. Trump's demand for a wall had little traction, really, in the U.S. Especially after both the current Mexican president, the previous Mexican president Enrique Peña Nieto and previous Mexican presidents like Fox said that they would not pay for it. There's some really interesting memes about the kind of aggressive stance that previous President Fox took in relation to Trump. Again, kind of repeating some of these masculinist or hegemonic masculinist forms of engaging with another man. So the wall really didn't have much traction until 2018, when the Central American caravans were organized and began moving towards the United States. As I mentioned, the representations of the caravans coming out of the Trump administration use imperial imaginaries of places that are represented as inherently poverty-stricken, chaotic, and violent. And these imperial imaginaries represent these places as absolutely distinct from and disconnected from the United States. However, the US and Central America are intimately connected and have been for over 2 centuries, right? Because of various episodes of US intervention. Most recently, the United States has heavily funded the dictatorships in those countries. Some of you may know some of this history, and engaged very intimately in the civil wars in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and they funded campaigns, right, of massacre, of numerous massacres against the population of those places, right? And those people, many of whom were classified as insurgents by the US training manuals, the US CIA training manuals, which were discovered afterwards. I'm not going to get into, obviously, much of the history of those connections, but I want to make it clear that the instability that continues to, or the political instability that continues to be seen in places like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras has everything to do with those civil wars and conflicts of the 1980s and into the 1990s. They also made sure that a lot of weapons were widely available in those places. Another factor that's really important to mention is, and some of you may know this as well, the so-called gangs that are continuously referred to in places like El Salvador and Honduras were actually exported from the United States to those countries, right? Because of the Salvadorians who tried to come to the US and get asylum, were denied asylum, had temporary residency in the United States and things like that. Some of those individuals, young men specifically, became involved in so-called gangs in the United States, and when they got deported to their so-called countries of origin, they took those kinds of social relationships to those places. So the point that I'm trying to make is that these imperial imaginaries that are put forward here mask all of these intimate connections between the United States and those countries. And they also, again, clear the United States, the government and its citizens of complicity in generating and supporting militarized and violent modes of addressing problems that were then and are now inherently political and social and economic in origin. So just as the US government refuses to acknowledge its involvement in the region over the years, it denies asylum to most of those people from those regions who come to the US seeking asylum. So just to give you some numbers, until 10, okay, that's good. Just to give you some quick numbers here. Between 2011 and 2016, US adjudicators denied 49% of all asylum claims made in the United States. But the denial rate for Mexico and the Northern Triangle was much higher. So 89.6 claims from Mexico were denied. A place, again, where the US is heavily involved in funding this so-called war on drugs, which has resulted in thousands and thousands of Mexicans being murdered and disappeared. 82.9 from El Salvador, denied. 77 from Guatemala, and 80% from Honduras. So these are very high denial rates. Some of you may have seen this very now infamous image of caravan, members of the caravans, as I mentioned, literally sitting at the border awaiting their turns. And at one point, the US Border Patrol, for circumstances that I don't remember all of the details at this moment, decided that they needed to be tear gassed. And so this particular image became quite famous because it shows obviously this woman trying to get her little kids out of the way of that tear gas. And the image also served to demonstrate to people who is actually sitting at the border petitioning for asylum, right? Who is at the border in these caravans? Are these bad hombres, right? Or are they women, children, etc.?
T-shirt.
The T-shirt. What Disney play is show is that?
Frozen.
Frozen. Sorry, don't have my Disney down. All right. So I'm not going to run through all of the regulations around who qualifies for asylum, because we don't have time for that. But what I wanted to sort of end talking about is to go back to the what I said at the beginning, which is that one of the things that we're trying to do in this paper is to emphasize the ways in which this class of young men who are petitioning for asylum on the grounds that they are being persecuted in their countries of origin have very little chances of having their petitions adjudicated fairly. And I just wanted to connect this discussion of the intimate relations between the United States and Central America to this issue of these bad hombres. And to do that, I wanted to very briefly talk about the asylum claims that some of the bad hombres are bringing forward. So we're not going to talk about sort of current asylum claims in the paper, but there are some very famous claims, cases that have been documented, that have been adjudicated in the past. And they all revolve around this question of what counts as a social group for protection under the rules that the US has set forward. So in this paper, we're going to focus only on petitions for asylum on the grounds that the person is facing persecution for resisting recruitment into a gang. So that is one of the things that some of these young men and also women are bringing forward. They're saying that they don't want to become part of gangs and they're being persecuted on those grounds. To me, this particular asylum claim that they're resisting recruitment is really important because it mirrors the situation facing many young men in El Salvador and some of the other countries during the civil wars in the 1980s. So it sort of connects us between this past and this present. And the film Voces Inocentes, or Innocent Voices, which is based on the true story of a particular individual, depicts this situation facing many young men, but also women in El Salvador and Honduras, who are resisting recruitment into so-called gangs. In the story, the young men in a particularly very poor part and more marginalized community in El Salvador, the young boys have to continuously hide, both from the military who comes into their communities to forcibly recruit, basically kidnap them and force them to join the military, or the insurgents at the time, the political insurgents. And they also would come into communities and try to indoctrinate and get young people, not just boys, to join. And in the story, the particular boy, the protagonist, doesn't want to do any of those things. He doesn't want to be forcibly recruited into the military, and he doesn't want to join the insurgency. He doesn't see any way out. And in the film, the only way out that he can imagine is to journey north, and he actually makes that journey by himself as like a 12-year-old kid. So the case of the young men and some women today, basically their masculinity, right, not just their physical safety, but also their masculinity is at stake in these situations where they're resisting recruitment. So are they gonna become a real man, right, and join these gangs, and also which enables them to bring home income to their families in places that are facing extreme poverty? Or are they gonna remain neutral, right, and refuse to participate? The cases where these individuals are bringing these petitions in the United States have had very difficult outcomes, which I'm going the wrong way again. So I'm just gonna very briefly talk about, or I won't talk about them, but I'll just mention a couple cases here where in the rulings against the petitioner, right, they talk about how they are being recruited into these gangs, and these are some of the rulings, right, and what they always do is transform the violence that the individuals are facing into something that's private, into something that is violence, squabbles between individuals, right? Nothing that relates to any kind of systemic violence. And in order to really help you to understand why I'm talking about it as systemic violence, we would have to get into this discussion of what these so-called gangs actually are. In many cases, they're actually paramilitary groupings that are actually supported and funded and work in correlation with police and military in these countries. So they're not just so-called gangs, right? Groups of men running around doing bad things, right? They're actually very much connected to those political or public institutions that are supposed to be providing security, which means that the security institutions are directly involved in not just the recruitment and the violence, right? And so, again, as in the story of Voces Inocentes, the people who don't want to participate in those, they have no room to move, right? The security forces are the ones that are participating in the violence and in the recruitment. And I'm sorry that we can't get into all of that, but it's probably not necessary anyway for this discussion. I'm not gonna end. I'm gonna end with this image, which I found very interesting. And I'll just say a few words. All right. So, news reports have shown that some of the individuals who have been deported to their countries of origin in the Northern Triangle have subsequently been killed by the very people that they feared. So there's lots of news stories that continuously come out talking about so-and-so, was sent back and he was killed, or she was killed. Nonetheless, the Trump administration's mapping of an imperial imaginary and a public-private binary onto violence, onto this so-called Northern Triangle, ensures that asylum claimants do not receive a fair hearing. In these contests over the power to identify, the US government is succeeding in excluding men and women racialized as inferior, and young men classified as bad hombres. Although the recent election of more women into the US Congress signals that there will be change ahead, we need to ensure that our critiques refuse these gendered binaries and hierarchical spatial formations. To create new opportunities, as Tal suggested at the outset, we need to refuse and to rebuild, or to rethink, or to reimagine, right? And feminist approaches are crucial to that reimagining. So thank you, that's what I have today.